Hello everyone, my name is Eirik. Welcome back into the studio for a casting in plaster tutorial. We're going to be casting this portrait of the Venerable Stefano, a staple model here at FAA. This portrait we made a little while ago, and there is a video series dedicated to the entire sculpting process and the mold making process as well. This time we're going to do the final step in the process of making any sculpture come to life, which is casting, of course. As you can see, we have two molds on the table here currently. One is a mohawk mold of a skull, and we worked within this mold before, and the other is the two-part mold for the portrait of Stefano, which we will be casting today. The reason I'm showing you both is just to show you the difference between the two. As you've seen, one is just one piece of silicone and the other is two pieces of silicone. The amount of monomold pieces are dependent on the shape of the sculpture itself, and in this instance we have two monomold pieces for both molds. The reason you'd want to do a two-part mold instead of a mohawk mold is because of the material you intend to cast your sculpture in. I'm speaking for portrait molds now, by the way, because if the mold is of something more complex, then a two-part mold might be required no matter the material. If you simply intend to cast in plaster, for example, and the sculpture is not too big or too complex, then a mohawk mold is going to be the simpler and faster options, both in terms of making the mold, but also in terms of casting within the mold. There is just simply less stuff to consider with a mohawk mold. A two-part mold is more complex and time-consuming to make, but it does allow for an easier time casting in a wider range of materials and in a wider range of methods. If you intend to reinforce your plaster casting with burlap, for example, then a two-part mold is going to be much easier to work with. If you'd like to cast your work in bronze at a foundry, they are going to be very happy with a two-part mold and a lot less happy with a mohawk mold. Okay, back to the task at hand here. We're working on the first layer of plaster that needs to be done within our mold currently. This layer is often referred to as a splash coat. Different places are going to have different names for it, but essentially this is just a thinner first coat that's meant to capture all the details of your sculpture as carefully as possible. The layer of plaster we're laying down here is what is going to be the surface of our sculpture in the end. Therefore, it's of course very important to do a really good job with this layer and make sure that everything is done to perfection or as close as we can get to that. You can see that I'm going fairly thin with this splash coat. We're going to be doing two splash coats, and therefore I can go a bit thinner with the first one and not build up too much thickness. This does a few things for me. It keeps air bubbles to a minimum and allows me to see them if they end up on the surface. With a thicker splash coat, they can be hidden. The air bubbles can be hidden underneath plaster since they're only a millimeter or so in height usually. But here the layer is so thin that the bubbles are going to either pop on their own or be visible to me to the naked eye, and therefore I can pop them myself when I see them. The layering strategy with plaster is very important. Once you begin, you shouldn't really stop, as plaster fuses best when layered on top of fresh plaster. This means that we do need to reserve a good few hours for making our plaster casting. There are ways around this issue that occur when new plaster meets older plaster, but we'd like to keep these types of solutions to a minimum and something we only use when it's really necessary and not something that we rely on. We will cover some of these kinds of solutions later on in the video, as we do run into some scenarios where we do need to use them. The layers are going to be as follows. Two splash coats. These layers are just straight plaster brushed thinly across the surface. They capture the details, and the second one adds some more thickness, evenness, and strength. Then we're going to have a layer of burlap. This layer will make the casting strong, yet keep the amount of plaster used to a minimum, and therefore keep the casting light at the same time. Burlap is a fabric, and this layer sort of functions like rebar in concrete. After that, there will be some other things done to the plaster casting, but nothing that will properly cover the entire inside of the casting itself like these first three layers do. Before closing the mold, we're going to build a little plaster edge along the edge of the mold itself, often referred to as a plaster wall. You've seen me do similar things on molds, but this time the plaster wall we'll build along the edge is going to angle a little downwards. Once the mold is then closed, this is going to give us a V-shaped channel running along the seam where the two halves of our mold meet. Once we then pour plaster into the closed mold, the plaster will run along this V-shaped channel, it will fill it, and close the seam for us. This is in the ideal world, of course, and as you'll see, even good strategies like this can fail from time to time, or at least partially fail. But we'll get into that later on in the video. With the two splash coats finished and the edges of the mold cleaned while the plaster was still wet, I can move on to the burlap layer. First of all, what is burlap? Burlap is an open weave fabric, sometimes referred to as jute or hessian, that's often used as a material for duties that require rough handling, say for sacks to ship farm product, sandbags, and to wrap tree root balls. I remember, for example, my dad using it to cover the roses during the winter in Norway. The purpose of this layer is to add strength to the casting without adding too much weight to it. We could of course pour the casting solid and perhaps get something equally as strong, but it would weigh a lot more, and if it falls off the table it's more likely to shatter. The burlap keeps the weight down, the strength up, and any damage the casting incurs is likely not going to be fatal, since the burlap inside the casting is going to hold the plaster in place more and keep it from shattering. Now, I don't know the physics behind why burlap works so well, but I do know that it works, which as a sculptor and as a craftsman is really all I need to know. I think it's good to keep some of the mysteries left in the world, so let's not look into it either. Believe me, burlap works. If you enjoyed the video, remember to like and subscribe, and if you want to see more in-depth content, visit my Patreon page by following the link in the description below. The plaster in my bowl is setting up now, and it's becoming sculptable cream cheese plaster. So instead of wasting it and mixing a new bowl for the burlap layer in the second half of the mold, I'm going to take a break from burlap here and move on to what is the final step to this process while the mold is still laying open. There's more stuff to do once the mold is finally closed, of course. That is, the final step we're going to reinforce the edge of the casting and build a plaster wall along it. I don't need to wait for the burlap layer to be set before starting this step, as the fragile splash coat by now is covered in a layer of burlap, which makes it strong. So we can jump right into this step using the same bowl of plaster as we used when we were applying the burlap, therefore saving some money and saving some material. I don't want a wall here that's parallel to the edge of the mold itself. I want a wall that has a bit of an angle to it, though I do want one edge of the wall to register near perfectly to the edge of the silicone. In terms of widths, we don't need it to be too wide, as ideally this casting isn't going to take a lot of abuse, so I don't need a ton of strength. I'd say something around 0.5 centimeter to 1 centimeter at most is more than enough strength for a casting like this. This plaster edge adds strength to the edge, but it also helps making sure the plaster will pour into the mold later has a channel to run down and into, filling the seam, locking the two halves together, and ideally leaving us with little repair work on the seam itself. You could use this technique no matter the material, but personally I find that it's a bit hit and miss. The areas you'd like material to be poured into following this V-shaped guide channel are usually areas that you can't see and can't reach once the mold is closed. There is therefore no way to inspect as you're working whether or not this trick has worked, or if it has failed. You can't tell if you actually got material where you wanted it to, until you open the mold. And as we'll see later in the video, it works in some places but not in others. Since plaster is very easy to work with in terms of sculpting it and shaping it, and it is cheap, I do think this step is worth doing, but a better strategy is to design sculptures and molds where there are big enough openings so that you can actually see and work within the casting itself once the mold is closed. We've already made the sculpture, of course, which means that it's too late for that, as this is something that has to be built into the clay sculpture itself. While I certainly don't think things were sculpted back in the day for this reason, since most of these types of sculptures were carved in stone and not cast in plaster, but using a more Greek/Roman style design to the base, which is the bottom of the mold and the opening we can work into, can help you get both a beautiful portrait that's well designed and a casting that you can easily work within. This cast is a plaster cast of a Greek/Roman era bust of Socrates? I'm not sure how you say it, but Socrates perhaps, from Thor's cast collection. Thor is a colleague and a friend, and he makes excellent plaster casts of historical sculptures, which you can buy online on his website. Plaster is an organic material that we sculpt while it's still wet, which means that no matter how good of a job we do end up with some plaster in places where we don't want it. I don't work enough with plaster to keep the mess to an absolute zero, so some rasping and scraping is required to make sure no plaster stands proud of the silicone edge and can interfere with the registration between the two halves of our mold. I will rasp the excess plaster off using my yellow Stanley rasp, then clean the silicone edge properly with a spatula. Any dust will then be brushed out of the mold using a brush. Dust left in the mold can fall on the silicone edge when the mold is flipped over to be closed and thus interfere with the fit. That's it for part 1 in this video. There's going to be a part 2 where we close the mold and open it, fix the seam, and get the casting ready for display. For now though, thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, remember to like and subscribe, and if you want to learn more, check out my Patreon page, where you can get instant access to over 50 hours of in-depth videos on sculpture, mold making, and casting. Until next time, stay creative.